Title, Reverse Mission Exists, Are Brazilian Churches Involved in It? Two perhaps separate issues. One, what is reverse mission? Is it happening? And if it is happening, are Brazilian churches involved in it? Now you might wonder, how does a Baptist minister from a small church on a housing estate in Kent end up doing a PhD on Brazilian churches in London? Won't go too far into my biography, but basically my parents were missionaries for 37 years in Brazil. And I was actually originally ordained as a minister of the Brazilian Baptist Convention. So I am originally actually a Brazilian Baptist. And I came to this country in 2005, and I was originally involved with Southall Baptist Church, a very multicultural area of London, but also a church which, through connections of the minister, senior minister, had contacts with many Brazilian churches, and many Brazilian churches came under the umbrella. And so when a chance came to do a PhD, it was a subject I was interested in. Now, I started off with one assumption, which I actually revised later on in the conclusion. We'll see later. I started off with the assumption that these churches, if they were really doing mission, if they were really genuine about what they were doing, they needed to be reaching beyond their fellow Brazilians. And that was a starting point, really. We talk about the unverbalized assumptions, but that was an assumption I had. We'll get back later. I actually revised that a little bit. But reverse mission, it's a term which has been common and fashionable. I mean, I've got someone here who's written books with the title Reverse Mission. Israel has written 2 books, I think, with the title Reverse Mission, and keeps a flag flying high on a subject. And even the BBC has picked up on it. You know, something is common when the BBC pays attention. About 2 years ago, a BBC series, Reverse Missionaries. Later follow on, I think it was this Lent, by a series by Channel 4, very short, in the lead up to Lent, on the sort of various international churches. It does reflect, in part, an awareness that the global face of Christianity has changed. If you were to go back nearly 100 years ago to the missionary conference in Edinburgh in 1910, what would, in people's minds, the typical Christian look like? And it would basically be a white, fairly middle-class European or North American. Go perhaps 100 years later, 2010, when the Lausanne group meet in Cape Town, what is the typical Christian? Well, the typical Christian is no longer the same person they were in 1910. In fact, it's someone probably from Africa or Latin America or Asia who is poor. Probably a woman, because a vast majority, and almost certainly Pentecostal. So when we talk about reverse mission, we deal with some interesting debating points. We can start with the basic one. What is mission? What do we count as mission? Now, I don't have time. We could spend a whole session just looking at that. I don't have time, but I'll point out that part of measuring whether reverse mission is happening or not depends on what we classify as mission. Perhaps more technical, we talk about reverse mission. What are we saying is being reversed? Are we talking about the reversal of colonial movements? So people returning to their colonial powers? Or are we talking about the reversal of mission movements? And sometimes in the literature you'll see that the two become confused. And with Brazil, it becomes a slightly more difficult concept because, as many of you know, Brazil was colonized by Portugal. Yet in terms of mission, and we're perhaps talking about evangelical mission, the main missionary influences on Brazil are North America and Sweden. So if you have a Brazilian in the United Kingdom, what are they reversing? They're not reversing a colonial movement. They are not really reversing one of the main... Like my parents, there were British missionaries who went to Brazil, but they are not reversing a significant mission movement. What would we consider an example of reverse mission? In a handout, I put 2 suggestions. Does a Brazilian church doing outreach among Asians in London qualify as reverse mission if they don't contact any British person at all? Is that reverse mission going on? Another one, is Hillsong an example of reverse mission? You know, I've read most of the literature on reverse mission. I've never seen Hillsong presented once as an example. Yeah, isn't it the ultimate example? Returning to its former, an Australian church, returning to its former colonial power. Could even introduce Vineyard. Is Vineyard an example of reverse mission? Or are we in a danger of saying that reverse mission only happens when it's done by people who look or sound different to us? Is there this kind of perhaps still a colonial or post-colonial undercurrent that reverse mission only happens if it's done by someone who seems very different to us and their churches are very different? And that perhaps in the background is a question. There may be talk about reverse mission. Is it actually happening? And if it is, what is the yardstick? Remember when my external examiner, he must have questioned me about 4 or 5 times in my Viva. What is the yardstick? How do you measure? How do you know if it is happening? So what is reverse mission? Well, we'll come to my practical definition, but I thought I'd better explain. There are some other definitions of reverse mission floating around. Some people say that reverse mission is a presence of non-Christian religions in the West. It's people setting up mosques. It's people setting up Hindu temples in London. Now, some people define that as reverse mission. Other people would say it is Western missionaries sharing with their supporters their actions overseas. And those influenced by liberation theology would often say it's when people who have been missionaries in developing countries come back to their own country and convince their supporters of the reality of injustice and oppression. And there's an interesting author called Timothy Bynes, how he describes it in terms of even influencing people in America over the impact of American foreign policy. So he gave the example of Dominican nuns working in El Salvador during a dictatorship which was propped up by the American government, returning to their churches and convincing people to campaign with the American government over issues of injustice, over issues of torture in El Salvador. So there are some interesting definitions floating around, but for our purposes, and it's the definition by Afiadogami that I'm working with, is how the traditional mission fields have now become the mission bases of renewed efforts to re-evangelize the fast secularizing societies of Europe and North America. I quite like it, it's nice and general. It leads to it doesn't have a very strict definition. You don't have to be reversing a particular colonial flow. You don't have to be reversing a particular mission flow. But where we see places which were traditionally mission fields, as many countries in Africa, as Brazil was, becoming a mission basis and becoming often self-conscious. Even back in Brazil, even back in places, and I imagine Israel would find this in Africa, even back home, which is a clumsy term to use, becoming aware of the need to evangelize Europe. And I interviewed as part of my PhD a couple whose decision to come to London was born by seeing an article in a Brazilian Baptist missionary magazine on churches being converted to mosques in London. And back in Brazil, this belief that we need to go to Europe, we need to go to London to bring the gospel back. Now, what forms might reverse mission take? One that is overlooked, but for Brazilians it is quite significant, I believe, is that of celebrities. Most British people, especially football fans, their main contact with Brazilian evangelicalism and Brazilian Pentecostalism will come when watching a football match involving Brazil players. If you think about the 2002 World Cup final, if those of us remember, when Brazil won, and that scene of all the players gathering round in a circle and praying and taking off shirts saying Jesus loves you or 100% Jesus. For many people, that is their first contact with Brazilian Christianity. A few years ago, there was an interesting picture in a newspaper of the then Chelsea defender David Luiz laying hands on Fernando Torres before a football match to try and help Fernando Torres' goal drought come to an end. I think it was one of those goal droughts that only came out with much prayer and fasting. But for many people, that is what they see. That is the public image of Brazilian Christianity. We saw that in the World Cup this year. And some of these celebrities, they actually finance mission initiatives. Some of you may remember Rivaldo, the one who got that great equaliser against England in the 2002 World Cup. Football bias is revealed here. He actually finances a Nigerian minister who speaks Portuguese, who's been a pastor in Brazil, to do mission work in 6 countries. So he actually pays this pastor as he goes on an itinerant ministry. It can take the form of Western denominations importing pastors and other Christian workers, churches who go deliberately to other countries. Some churches have gone deliberately to Brazil to search for youth workers, to search for worship leaders. In fact, there's an organisation in Brazil called Go to the Nations, which tries to link up British churches with Brazilian churches to facilitate this crossover. Equally, it can take the form of non-Western churches organising themselves to export missionaries. I have friends who are missionaries in Spain, supported by Brazilian Baptists in Brazil. Others who are missionaries in Sweden. Over Europe, you'll find many Brazilian missionaries supported by missionary agencies in Brazil. And then the other form, which was the focus of my research, is the area of what you might call migrant churches or diaspora churches, of which Brazilian churches are an example. I would just add, as we go more in detail into Brazilian churches, that I would be rather cautious about generalising my findings. I believe my findings are quite applicable to the Brazilian context. They do raise interesting questions about the Asian context and the African context, but the dynamics of Brazilian migration to the UK are very different from African migration and Asian migration. So we just have to be cautious in some of the generalisations we might be tempted to make. Are Brazilian churches involved in a process of re-evangelising Europe, re-evangelising the United Kingdom? Some people are sceptical. Arguably, one of the most sceptical is a British sociologist based in Brazil and Canada called Paul Freston, who's probably one of the top experts on the Brazilian church. And he is actually sceptical about whether migrant churches in general are involved in reverse mission. So Brazil is an example of a wider scepticism. And his basically starting point is there's, on the whole, a lack of evidence of success among indigenous population. Now, I did circulate a reading list, and I don't know who had the time to read it. If you went through the reading list, you may have come across one example repeated again and again, which is Sunday Adeja's Embassy of God in Kiev, Ukraine. He's a Nigerian, but his church is 99% Ukrainians, and we're talking about a church, thousands of people. Now, Preston makes a point, isn't it interesting that whenever someone gives an example, they always go back to the same guy? That suggests that maybe there aren't that many examples around there. He points to the lack of cultural sensitivity, the lack of missiological training. Many Brazilians who will plant a church in UK may have never had any theological training, but it's almost certain that they won't have had any cross-cultural training. They wouldn't have had any preparation in dealing with other cultures. And he points out that what actually happens in practice is that the needs of the immigrants will always tend to come before attempts to reach the indigenous population. That whenever a change to reach the English-speaking or the British-speaking, no, the Brazilian, if that's going to alienate Brazilians, that's a step a Brazilian church won't take. Not everyone shares in this scepticism. Partly it comes to our definition of mission. Richard Burgess, who studied the Redeemed Church of God, he makes a very valuable point that migrant churches improve society in different ways. Not just evangelizing the indigenous population. And he looked a lot at like the Redeemed Church of God work involving debt and drug rehabilitation. And his point was this makes an impact on society. It may not involve specifically always evangelistic actions, but it does improve society. Afradogami suggests that actually these churches, they provide a ministry of presence. They change the face of Christianity. You know, rather than that church building in London being sold off and converted into a pub or a mosque, it gets taken over by an African church. That has a visible impact. You know, rather than Channel 4 running a programme on a very elderly congregations. I have lots of elderly people in my congregations, nothing against elderly congregations, but they run a programme on dynamic, vibrant churches. And people who watch Channel, they see the people dancing, and they see the people excited about their faith. But my favourite response is actually one by Hanchili, simply saying, actually diaspora churches are recent. It is too early to make any assessment. The first missionary churches were set up in Brazil back in the 1850s. By 1910, they had had very little impact. 60 years of perhaps very slow growth. In fact, the first American Baptists arrived in Brazil in the 1850s, 1860s. The first Baptist church was founded in 1880. 20 years in which very little happened, except for an English-speaking church in Santa Barbara do Oeste. And yet sometimes we see quite harsh judgments sometimes made of churches which have only been around for 5, 10, 15 years. Now, perhaps our mission experience suggests we have to let time go by a bit more. We have to see things happening. Brazilian churches in the United Kingdom reflect the fast growth of evangelicalism in Brazil. I hasten to point that evangelical in Brazil means anyone who is a Trinitarian Christian who is not a Catholic. So it would include your most liberal Anglican to your most outspoken Pentecostal. It's a wide spectrum. Although in practice, because so many Brazilian Christians tend to be Pentecostal, the spectrum isn't always so wide. In the handout, there are some statistics. 1940, 2.6% of the population were evangelical. By 2010, we're talking about 22.2%. And it is predominantly Pentecostal. If you're not a Pentecostal in Brazil, you're a very small minority among evangelicals. In the UK, the presence of churches reflect the growth of the Brazilian population. You get a lot of stupid estimates around about the Brazil. I've heard numbers as high as 450,000 Brazilians in the United Kingdom. Sensible estimates suggest that, and mainly in London, Swindon, curiously, and Bournemouth are other places where you have quite significant Brazilian populations, but predominantly in London, the range would be somewhere between 40,000 to 180,000. Anything higher than that is just being made up. The reason for the difference is because at least a large proportion of Brazilians are irregular. They do not have a valid visa covering their presence in the country. Well, what proportion? We don't know, because they are irregular. It's a bit of a catch-22 situation. I tend to veer towards the more conservative side of suggesting perhaps somewhere around the range of 60,000 to 80,000. Among those who have studied Brazilian migrants, I tend to be a minority. Most other people tend to put it up to about 180,000. This was a population which grew dramatically between 2000 and 2010 due to economic issues in Brazil and also to the tightening of visa restrictions in the United States. After 9/11, going to America, which is the first aim of most Brazilians, became very difficult. Europe became much easier, especially with the European Union. Some Brazilians can get to Portugal and Spain, and because they had great-grandparents, or in Italy, or great-grandparents, they can get a EU passport, and then they can come to the country legitimately. Also means it's harder to count them, because on official documents they are Portuguese and Italian, although the Italians may not speak a single word of Italian, and they are Brazilians. There are signs that the growth of the population has slowed down. Unfortunately, the Home Office changed its way of counting people, so it's no longer able for us to track how many Brazilians are actually entering and leaving. But there are signs it has slowed down. It will probably in the future stabilise and shrink. A lot of it depends on the relatively next 10 years in terms of the British economy and the Brazilian economy, and how effective the British government are in controlling immigration, whether Britain stays in the EU or leaves the EU. All the factors that we don't know. And we don't know how many churches there are. They're at least likely to be 100 or more. When I did my Viva, my internal examiner, he asked me in the second edition, as your final corrected version, to include a map and a list of indicative list of churches. So I did actually produce a list and a map. And if those of you, I know there's a digital copy that the college has of my thesis, and everyone's free to look at it. There is actually a map. I don't really think the map's worth the paper that it's printed on, but it satisfied the requirement. We really don't know, but at least 100, just, from what you know. I don't include, some of you may have heard of the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God. It's a very controversial church in Brazil. I do not really include it, basically because in the UK it presents itself as an Afro-Caribbean church. It has decided in the UK it does cater for the Brazilian community, but its main focus is the Afro-Caribbean community. And in London it is mainly Pentecostal. Actually, the non-Pentecostal presence is almost insignificant. You would find very few non-Pentecostal Brazilian churches in London, and those that are would probably not number more than 30 to 40 people. You go to a pastor's meeting of Brazilian pastors, and you see all the ministers, and the non-Pentecostals could just about fit into a mini. It is predominantly Pentecostal, and it has generally grown from the arrival of evangelical migrants. People who are already evangelical arrive in London and look for a church. And increasingly there have been more and more churches. There are some examples of people who convert after they migrate. There are also examples of people who take a holiday from church whilst they are in the country. But on the whole, it is mainly new arrivals. So actually, in my fieldwork, what did I do? Well, one thing I did was I listened to hundreds of hours of church services. I joke, in some cases I felt I knew the theology of some pastors probably better than they did themselves. And what I discovered is that there's a very strong discourse of reverse mission in churches. Nearly all of them talk about having an impact in the city, in this land, Many of them talk about bringing back the fire is a very common expression. This comes first from a sense of responsibility. They've read in the Bible, go to the nations, preach the gospel. They know that that's something they should be doing. There's a sense of gratitude. Some of them think, well, in the past, all these Europeans went all over the world to share the gospel, including the British. We have been impacted by that. It's our turn. I have a friend in Sweden who describes his missionary project as kind of time to pay it back, time to retribute, time to give back. And in the past we've received from Europe, now it's the time to give. There's also not only an awareness of the numerical decline of Christianity in the UK, there's an exaggeration of the numerical decline in the UK. If you were to listen to many leaders and pastors, you would get the impression that all churches had no one under the age of 85 playing old pianos, singing hymns of 400 years ago. So it's not only just awareness of decline, but there is an exaggeration. It's one of the ironies, I once saw a Brazilian church in London advertise. I'll give you the Portuguese. It's a primeira marcha para Jesus em Londres. Now, Marcha para Jesus is a very common event in Brazil. It actually translates as March for Jesus, which in Brazil has about 1 million, sometimes thousands in claims of millions of people on them. And this church was advertising the first March for Jesus in London. Some of us might think, well, been there, seen the movie and got the T-shirt. So there's an exaggeration, and linked with that is a belief that the British church on its own will not carry out the task. I remember one sort of pastor, he was talking with his congregation, and they rented a church, and he was describing how he would want to perhaps rent the church at 6 o'clock in the morning for a prayer meeting, and he said that this would be a shock for the English, having a prayer meeting at 6 o'clock in the morning. Not a fair judgment, but a belief that actually, these British people, they can't do the job anymore. It has to be us. It has to be us from outside. It also means to legitimize your presence, right? Especially back in Brazil. Sometimes the complaint in Brazil about British church pastors who go to Britain is, they're just there for the pounds and the money and all the resources. But it's a way back in Brazil. When you go back in Brazil on your holidays, I say, no, we're missionaries in the United Kingdom. We're reaching home. However, there is very limited success. There are some examples which might flourish even further in the future. Looking around, you do find some good examples of things having an impact beyond Brazilians. Not all of them may be able to be upscaled as a wide thing. A lot of it's to do with a particular person's personality, a particular person's ability. But one case, it's a very small case, a very small, relatively small Brazilian church in Hounslow started meeting in a Baptist church in Hayes, Harlington area. Now, this church was programmed to close down. It had a student in training the plan was when a student of training finished his ministry, he would go on to another ministry and the church would close down. What happened was when the Brazilian church started meeting, they started working together, and actually the two congregations became one. So whereas the church would have been closed down, the church is still open and actually growing and involved in mission in the community and doing all kind of things. So there are some examples, but there are few. But they may flourish. But what I discovered is that for some leaders, and I don't mean this in a cynical way, the discourse is actually the reverse mission. They see their role in reverse mission mainly to be present here, praying and prophesying about it. And that's where the reverse mission takes place. That's where we are going to change things. We are going to pray and we are going to prophesy about it. And we're going to be part of this movement where God is going to change the spiritual landscape of Britain, even if nothing else much seems to happen. Others, however, place their hope in the second and third generations. That those who are born here, who came very young here, who have entered the school system, who speak fluent English, who have got British friends, they say, well, this is the first generation are getting their foot in. The next generation are the generation which will perhaps be more effective. And sometimes without making grandiose claims, but if these churches manage to retain 1 in 2 of their young people, in 10 years, that's quite a large influx, especially if these churches maintain their mission motivation. That's quite a large influx of people who are aware of the culture, aware of the language, who are able to engage in missions. So some would say, well, don't write us off yet. We're getting our foot in the door. What are the challenges? Why is it so difficult to go from talking and praying about reverse mission to actually doing something about this? One is actually, well, what do the migrants want? Most Brazilians in the UK are target earners. They don't actually want to stay in the UK. Most, when they arrive, want to stay for 2 to 3 years and end up staying 4 to 5. They want to earn enough money to pay off their debts in Brazil, buy a house, and if possible, set up a small firm in Brazil. That's what many come for. And so they're not thinking long term. They're not thinking about settling and getting to know the culture and getting to know I'm here for the short term to come in. That's why some take a holiday for church. Not that they've lost their faith, but they're thinking, for these 2 years, I'm going to focus on getting what I want. I can worry about serving church. I can send my tithe back to Brazil to pay for projects and whatever. I'm here to earn money. And they face a difficult reality. It's a reality of long working hours, insecure jobs. I'm talking some people who during the week will work perhaps 16 to 18 hours and perhaps get 3 or 4 hours of sleep. Very poor living conditions. Perhaps 12, 14 people sharing a 3-bedroom flat in which there are 3 different families and only 1 toilet. Very difficult life. Means they have little time to devote to church. Most people, even if they go to church, their commitment to church goes down in comparison to Brazil. And churches are kept going by that small minority who take on more and more. So what I discovered is that most people tend to reduce their involvement in church. A small minority increase it quite a lot. And it's a very needy reality. The ministers are a mixture of surrogate parents, legal advisors, social workers. Many of the ministers have to work themselves. So many of them go from having their own job to keep their own family supported to having to cope with one migrant who's lost a job and he needs to be put into contact with that Brazilian who can get him a job in a cleaning firm, with helping the other one who's been detained by the police and can't speak English in dealing with the police, and arranging the furniture for someone else who's been deported. That takes up time. Now, if you're working 40 hours, you've got a busy Sunday and doing all this other stuff, the time for perhaps mission becomes squeezed. Language is an issue. Churches tend to have few members who are proficient in English. It can be different for the second generation. Though what I have observed is that the more proficient a Brazilian becomes in English, the more likely they are to leave the Brazilian church and go to an English-speaking church. And so in a church, you tend to have very few people. And the problem is that English people, British people, aren't as nice about language as we Brazilians are. My two sides, we British are not as nice as we Brazilians. If you're an English person and you go up in Brazil in a church and speak really terrible Portuguese, they will love you for it. I think in most of our churches, someone comes in and speaks terrible English. How will the congregation show the same sympathy, the same love? It hasn't been my experience. And there's a cultural issue. Brazilians have tended to think they don't need to learn about English culture. They don't need to be learning culture because we Brazilians, we're flexible. We're spontaneous. And I've had it told to people, we don't need to worry about culture because we Brazilians can fit in anywhere. Really means you just make mistakes quicker. And there's a problem. Brazil has something called o jeitinho brasileiro. And I've got a Brazilian here. I say, how would you explain a Brazilian? When I say, you know what jeitinho brasileiro is, of course. How would you explain it?
In English?
Yeah, well, not easy, is it?
No. It's that you can do whatever you can do just to get your way.
Yes. It literally means, if we translate it, it's called the Brazilian little way. Whenever there's a rule, tradition in Brazil, whenever there's a rule, a regulation, a Brazilian might ask, is there a little way? Can we find a jeitinho? Can we not break the rule, but kind of bend it? Get round it? You can imagine the problems that causes in British culture. Yeah. The Brazilian church under a British church is giving its charity number, but we'll just pay our ministers cash for hand and not record anything for tax purposes or national insurance. Or the Brazilian who actually gave a testimony, and her testimony was, in her days, when you had to come in the country, you had to have, I think it was £1,000 to be allowed in. And she only had £750. So she handed it in to the guy and gave it over and said, well, I prayed. And thank the Lord he didn't count it. And I said, you actually lied about it's this way. You don't break the rule, but you're just trying to. But it causes all kinds of problems, even in relationals. Context is an issue. In Brazil, the church has grown at the expense of nominal Catholics and people who have practiced what were known as Afro-Brazilian religions. Most Brazilian Christians have not had an experience of a secularized culture and very little contact with people who adhere to world religions prior to migration. That's a big difference, I think, from when we talk about some places in Africa. For most Brazilians, a Muslim is a theoretical construct. A Hindu is an abstract until they come to the UK. And, I've heard stories in Southall, when I was in Southall, Brazilians who would go in just a shop to buy something in Southall and who would run out scared and terrified because of all the demons in the shop, because of the Hindu statues. Well, it's going to be difficult. And so you find that your evangelistic strategies, which worked back in Brazil, don't work here. And in many cases, well-meaning people have done things to reach out to British people and the wider community. Hasn't worked, but let's go back to what we know best. And let's reach out to Brazilian churches. One solution, people say, well, what if you could get the two together? What if there could be a partnership with British churches, such as the example I quoted? I tell you, that example took about 7 years to get off the ground. It is not easy, and it's very rare. One problem is isolation. Many Brazilians do not have British friends. Many ministers do not have contact with fellow British ministers. They have negative attitudes towards British culture, towards British churches. Again and again, I'd hear in sermons and testimonies, Britain is spiritually cold. It's cold. It's a dangerous place. It's spiritually dangerous. It's emotionally dangerous. It's economically dangerous. Right. If you simply view the culture that you're in as dangerous and something you need to be protected, and your church is your shelter from the storm, that's going to make difficult some of the mission engagement. On the other hand, there's also rejection. Many ministers struggle, Brazilian ministers who are well-meaning struggle to find acceptance from British peers. There's a scepticism towards non-British training and non-British accreditation. I used to have a few friends who were Brazilian Baptist ministers, and we used to joke that it was easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a Brazilian to enter the Baptist Union. I took a Brazilian pastor who didn't speak very good English, but he was part of a church in Brazil that has about 5,000 to 10,000 people. His denomination in Brazil is about 2 or 3 times larger than the Baptist Union. Let's see what we can do to get him in partnership with the... And he starts saying, well, this is what you need to do. This is what you need to do. And he's like, well, Daniel, I'm almost 50. Is it worth going through all these hurdles? And in the end, what are you going to get? We haven't got much time to talk about theology, but theology is an issue. Prosperity theology, whatever we mean by that. Fundraising strategies, spiritual warfare, are all topics that even when Brazilian and churches and British churches want to work together, can flare up. I had one Brazilian minister in our church in South. He came to help having construction. He actually did a fundraising kind of as part of his sermon. The British pastor sort of said yes, and that's the last time he's doing it. But I want to end on a positive note. And the first thing is where I changed my mind. And I came to the conclusion that migrant churches, they play a valuable role without the need to be legitimised by a discourse of reverse mission. Great if they do it, but actually who is going to help that person who is about to be deported? Who is going to help that guy who's lost his job? He's not eligible to any unemployment benefit. Who is going to put him in contact with that person who has the job within a Brazilian? Who is going to actually help spiritually? No, that person who's arrived from Brazil doesn't speak a word of English. Where are they going to who still needs to hear the Bible? Who still needs to hear the word? Who is going to help them? So there is a sense in which there doesn't need to be a discourse of reverse mission. Some people would say, if churches, and I've heard people, if they're not involved in evangelising the British community, they've sort of failed in their mission. I would reframe that and say, well, for some churches, actually, reaching Brazilians is all that they can do. And it's wrong to expect more of them than that. I do believe that they can function as a watering well. There are Brazilians who work in various British churches and other churches, but who sometimes just feel the need of something from their own culture. Something that's the kind of music that they were used to listening to back home, the kind of word they were using back home. Migrant churches can be a place where they can turn to and be re-nourished and re-strengthened. Perhaps more significantly, for many individuals, they can become a stepping stone for reverse mission. And I've come across quite a few examples of people who are now involved in evangelising and mission among British people and other cultures, who are now in multicultural churches or British churches, however we define those, who started off in a Brazilian church. They've moved on. But that was a stepping stone. That was a place they arrived in the UK, they survived in the UK, where they were while they learnt the language, while they learnt the culture, and they've moved on. And that church, in that sense, has contributed towards reverse mission, towards mission, even if its own focus is within its own community. And I'll end my bit, just slightly over time, but hopefully getting there. Perhaps 4 questions which perhaps can help us in our debate, and 4 implications. I think the key thing is Brazilian churches in the United Kingdom remind us that the global changes to Christianity are having an impact in this country. It's not just down in Africa or in Brazil or in Asia that we're seeing the change in what a typical Christian is. It's actually on the streets of London, Manchester, even Ashford. And I sometimes believe that sometimes even some of the discussions on reverse mission, they are hampered by assuming that the normal face of Christianity in Britain is white and middle class. Some of you may echoes of the exotic other that we are in danger of falling into. I'll tell a story. Last week, we allowed another church to have a baptism. We are a small home mission church on a housing estate. And this is an African church fellowship who have also managed to have some impact on the traveller community and some of the dropouts of society are starting to be impacted. And they had a baptism, and suddenly as I was starting to finalise the thing, I thought, you know what? What if the normal, the mainstream of British Christianity is actually their church? And we are the other, the exotic, the minority, the small. What if it actually changed? Are we hampered by simply thinking, a normal Christianity in this country is white and middle class? And as we move forward, and as I believe the Christianity in this country increasingly becomes a faith of those who are marginalised and vulnerable, what are the theological and missiological implications? I believe that we are very good at being the church for the poor. Food banks. Who speaks out these days? It's nearly always a church person. We had that wonderful report, The Lies We Tell Ourselves, came out 2 years about all the lies being spread about in the media and politicians, about people on benefits. That came from church. Benefits Street. That terrible programme. One of the persons who stood up for it was a Baptist minister, Steve Chalk. In fact, one of the persons in the street says the only people who care about us are the church. We're very good at being church for the poor. We're quite good at being a church with the poor. Where I think many of us struggle is being a church of the poor. And that's perhaps a lesson we can learn from people arriving in the UK. These new churches which are set up, which have been, often in their home country, churches of the poor, where the poor are leaders. Think about the very difficult journey a poor person would have in our community, someone who's on benefits, unemployed, who feels called to the ministry. How would be that person's journey to become accredited minister of the Baptist Union? And compare it perhaps with the Redeemed Church or some of the Brazilian churches. What does it mean to be church of the poor? Where they are. And I think that's something that some of these churches do bring lessons, different models which are less expensive, which have less restrictions. And I also think for those of us who are perhaps in more what might be called a traditional British end, should we educate people in our churches, for lack of a term, I put the term in cosmopolitan? Do people actually need to be educated to be more cosmopolitan? Yes. Do they need to be educated to think in terms of kingdom values rather than British values? Now, do we need to tell people in the church, where do you read the United Kingdom in the Bible? Where do you read Britain? Because we confuse this. How many times, even sometimes when you have a discussion with people in the churches, it's what's good for our country? What's good for people like us? And perhaps, do we need to educate people to become more cosmopolitan, to think internationally, to think globally, to think in terms of belonging to a universal kingdom? So my final suggestion, perhaps we should just burn all the copies of the Daily Express that we can lay hold of. Thank you.
I said we have a whole new world of closed books about many of us, and really interesting insights. So thank you very much. I know we've come from different places with different experiences, but how are you responding to what Daniel has brought to us? Who wants to go first? Michael.
I would just like to say thank you for a very stimulating and challenging presentation. I found it really fast-moving but attention-grabbing and really made me think about it. I mean, do you think really that it's a case of learning on the job with regard to reverse mission? And this is actually what happened actually when a lot of our missionaries went out to the colonies. I mean, I have a friend who's come from Nigeria, and one of the things that he focused on was actually not bringing his culture to the UK.
I think, yes, I think that you're asking in terms of being learning on the job. My answer would be yes, that is probably what tends to be happening. But is that really how we should envisage the future? In the sense that, in an ideal world, the more you could build bridges so that people become more culturally prepared, become more culturally aware. I'm not thinking so much upon that person who has come perhaps to the United Kingdom to plant a church amongst his own people. And as I said, I think there's a value in that. But for someone who wants to actually engage in mission, we'd want to have a bit more bridge building. Sometimes it's a worry that I sometimes find is that we think that it's acceptable, or we count, let's say if I were to go to Nigeria or some in Africa and set up a church just for the British people there and say that I was doing mission, you'd be missologically shot down. Yet sometimes the reverse, we don't think in those terms, but a lot of these people, they are able to learn about culture. They're no less able to learn about culture than the British person. They have that ability. So perhaps what you need is links. Places where people can go and be trained, and actually where your person from Nigeria can be trained about the rather strange habits that British people have, but rather than speak negatively about it, discover that it's a thing you have to positively engage with. British people have a very strange thing for Brazilians. When you go to when they invite you to a meal, you're expected to bring something with you. When they invite you invite them to a meal, they'll bring something. Now, many Brazilians will say the same. Don't you like my cooking? Don't you think I've got enough resources? But rather, to be educated, to say, well, that's the way the British are. But engage with that positively. And that's I think, where the missing link is. I know that's something that Israel's sort of in the pipeline thinking over with the Centre for Missions of in that majority world is one of the issues. How can we bring the link so that the cultural learning takes place?
Thank you. It's great.
Mm-hmm.
I really loved it.
Mm-hmm.
I was a pastor in West London.
Mm-hmm.
Knew several Brazilian churches.
Mm-hmm.
And Brazilians in my church as well. Just two questions really kind of connected. Is that you mentioned the second and third generation
Mm-hmm.
as a possible positive.
Mm-hmm.
What a number of the churches in London that I know find is that actually the second and third generation is a real problem
Mm-hmm.
because they're not Brazilians. They're kind of hybrid
Yes.
Londoners.
Mm-hmm.
And so the Brazilian way of doing
Mm-hmm.
church doesn't really
Yeah.
appeal to them.
Mm-hmm.
And how do they work
Mm-hmm.
with that? So it's a question,
Yeah.
it's a positive, how could that be a bridge?
Mm-hmm.
But also, is that not going to be a negative for
Mm-hmm.
the churches?
Yeah.
In terms of examples, there's a church, Christian community in London.
Yeah, it's a meeting.
Hamilton Mansa.
Yeah.
And they have fitfully occasionally tried something they call J-point,
Yeah.
which kind of goes up and then collapses.
Yeah.
There's a deliberate attempt to reach out to English-speaking people. I don't say English.
Yes. Again,
Anybody really.
it's a loaded concept anyway.
So that's been their deliberate attempt
Yeah.
to do that. And I would say just two things about it. Well, three. One is it's multicultural.
Yeah.
It's not British.
Yes.
You know what I mean? Second, it's trying to use the music
Mm-hmm.
and the culture
Yeah.
positively as a draw because it is cool
Mm.
and attractive. But thirdly, it keeps failing.
Yeah.
They run it for a while and it
Yeah.
drops. They run it for a while and it drops. So those are the two questions.
Yeah.
One is this, the positive attempts to reach
Mm-hmm.
out, J-Pond kind of examples, the problems with that. But also, what about the second and third generation?
I think there's an interesting tie-in with the question. First thing, I think one of the difficulties is, and I think it's relating to perhaps this cultural education that is needed, which was perhaps from the other question, understanding that those second and third generation are forming a new culture, an old culture, and being willing to let go of existing ways that we did church in Brazil to produce something relevant for this generation is a challenge. Although, even if that second or third generation simply flows into British churches or multicultural churches, it is still a positive movement which would have a positive impact, even if we find the Brazilian church itself can't keep it. It's when they get completely lost. And that's one of the difficulties, that in Brazil there's still little experience of dealing with secular culture and the kind of questions that secular culture raises, as opposed to the kind of cultures of a nominal Catholicism with sort of influence of spiritualism. Linked with that, I think two things that I think Brazilian churches, it's a challenge, is that most methodology in Brazil is you are used to short-term getting quick results. If you do especially amongst Pentecostals, stories of starting a church with 20 people and having a church of 200 people 2 years later are not rare. Not saying they're normal, but they are there. And there's always that expectation of fast growth, which is where I think when I talk about the exaggeration of the decline of the UK church becomes a handicap, because they are not put in touch with some of the good stuff that is going on in the UK. No, it's not all doom and gloom. It's... Oh, sorry, has it gone off? Sorry. I must have...
No.
Oh, sorry. That bit has come out. Okay, sorry. When did it go off? Was it a long time ago or just now? Oh, good. So I don't need to go back. Oh, no, if not, I'd have to go back a bit and explain a bit more. Yes. There's not that contact with that. And actually, one of the problems is, and as I find that most Brazilian evangelistic methods is, get it right, they will come. And one thing that many British churches have discovered, and even I've got, that's not always the case. Is not getting the right event in place. Sometimes it's doing things that last for 2, 3, 4, 5 years, building up relationship, building up bridges. But if you're still in that mentality that if you haven't baptized another 50 people by the end of the year, that has failed, you're never going to... So I think that there's a two...
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
This is really interesting because I work with a lot of Brazilian missionaries.
Okay. Yeah.
But because we find ourselves right on the interface where we have Brazilians coming over saying, I feel called by God to be a missionary in London. But they don't have a sense of, I don't quite know what the word is, but like that missional support behind them.
Okay.
So we've built up over, 100, 200 years of missional activity. Kind of, what's it called? I'm not a missional person. So, like support, partner support, caring, and you raise funds, and all of that's very normal. So if someone's going on mission, it's a very clear framework of what that involves. And we're finding we're connecting with these missionaries who come over. They've got no language, they've got no support. They're literally just coming over and, quite like God told me, so here I am. And I was wondering if you have a comment on that as to how best to support them. Part of my job is to train people.
It's easier, as in all these things, to perhaps provide a little bit more information about the diagnosis of why it happens. I'm not sure too many people actually crack the solution. I mean, it's both a cultural thing and an economic thing. Culturally, the first thing you start is that, unfortunately, in the Brazilian church, missionaries have a very low status and they are idealised, but they actually in practice have a low status. And people will expect missionaries to accept circumstances which the pastor and the leaders of the church would not accept for themselves. That's a cultural thing. So a classical, again, there's a church, a very large church in Brazil. It has a very large music group. It's a very wealthy church, and it has missionaries in different parts of the world. They have missionaries in Israel. So the church leadership went to visit the missionaries in Israel, and they stayed in a hotel because they wouldn't want to stay in the homes that the missionaries were living in. That's a culture, and that's part of a challenge, Why does a missionary have to have a decent car? Even though the minister might be driving a new car back in Brazil, but if they're about 4 wheels and it's just scraped through its MOT, that would be enough for them. Also, there's not that, you might say, going back to what we might call the Protestant ethic, and that culture of saving and long-term commitments is not so ingrained in Brazil, especially because the economy does not facilitate long-term commitments. It is easier to give 1,000 reais offering on a Sunday than it is to give 100 reais a month for the next 2 to 3 years. I think it's a challenge we may start, BMS and other organisations may start to face in this country on the way that we are going. But that is a challenge, how can I... And so people sometimes, in excitement of the moment, they will support and the missionary will come. 6 months later, they're either out of mind and the person's forgotten to give it, or the person who supported them just can't sustain it, and they couldn't really sustain it. They were taken. And those are the challenges. Some Brazilians have tried to get around it by looking for more professional recruitment, having as missionaries people who can go overseas and actually work and support themselves and not be so dependent on giving from home. It works for lots of sports, not just the high flyer sports, but you have football coaches who go perhaps sometimes some closed countries. They're paid by the local club and they engage in mission, more aware of engineers. But yeah, if you find there's lots, if you read a lot of literature on Brazilian churches, that is one. No, there's this lack of. How can you long-term plan if that person has got no support beyond 6 months? It's a big issue.
Yes, it's very interesting what you're saying, and I'm Brazilian and I'm really impressed. And what you're saying is true. Following what you're saying about the missionaries, I think there is a difference between churches and missionaries. Yeah. And I think that what you're saying, following what you asked, is that in Brazil, it's a cultural thing.
Yes.
Like, they expect the missionaries to work, to go, they give resources for a certain period of time, and then after that, the churches, they expect them to raise money themselves. Yes.
Yeah. I think, if I can... And again, in dynamic in Brazil, you might have people like the Baptists in Brazil and other groups who have perhaps more replicated the structures that we have in this country, and therefore they tend to send less missionaries, but the missionaries tend to be more sustainable. While other agencies, perhaps it is less sustainable. I think that's the big difference. And again, you have a difference because sometimes you get missionaries who are sent by interdenominational agencies compared to missionaries who are simply sent by one local church.
And I think that's what you're saying about reverse mission. Like, I think there's a difference between churches and missionaries. Because I believe, in my experience, that the missionaries, they tend to work, and they work in the community, and they try to work towards the people. Rather than the churches, when they are planted by a Brazilian, or they don't have that kind of mind. They don't think that they can.
And it's interesting that Paul Freston, who I referred, who's very sceptical about churches as a form of reverse mission, he sees a lot of potential for missionaries and the partnership involved in bringing missionaries and bringing these contacts between perhaps mission agencies in the non-Western world and churches here, and people learn the culture, and that's the point.
I think the point you make about cultural awareness is absolutely spot on. It affects people from other countries. In our church, we have a very well integrated Nigerian population. We also have Asian people and so on. It's an Anglican church, but you won't mind that. And we had a guy turn up one Sunday evening about 7 or 8 years ago, at least 8 years ago, from India. He, by his own account, was a missionary. Friends had sent him and his wife and their 2 children to England. He was living in a small council flat nearby. He didn't have a car. My wife and I ended up giving a car to him. And because of that, we were invited very pressingly to have a meal with them. So we went. They did not eat a thing. They insisted on serving us. It wasn't a bit like a British meal. In addition, when we got halfway through, I don't know how he afforded it, he got a large electric guitar and all the equipment out and started singing rather old children's choruses to us. And he said, what I would really like to do is get a small group of English children, tell the little children about Jesus. He knew nothing about child protection and things of that sort. He was totally unaware of all the ramifications of English culture. I was scared stiff when I went with him in the car. Oh yes, I have an international driving license. But he was driving. I took him to a remote country area where there was a road with no vehicles on it, driving straight down the middle of the white line. So you should be this side of it. No, from India. India this time. His life went on sadly. He got a job. His wife got a job, both in helping in care homes. The marriage split up, and so on, he still very occasionally comes to our church. He seemed to think that our minister, and we have 3 paid ministers, well, it was 4 I think at the time, we were giving money for a 4th in our church. He seemed to think that he ought to be invited to be part of our team in our church. And the whole expectation was way out of kilter with what anyone trying to come and do mission in England should expect.
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting. Just an interesting bracket, because one of the things about Brazilians is how to do with Anglicanism is a fascinating concept for them. Usually, because I find that most Brazilians, they start asking me, are Anglicans Catholics? And actually one of the things that try to help them adapt to UK is actually give them a bit of a lecture, a bit funny, a Baptist explaining that, but a bit of the Anglican Church and the varieties that exist in the Anglican Church, and you can't judge it because one church you saw is like this, the other church is like that, and it's just quite an interesting... The actual story he told, perhaps it's the 2 sides of the coin. One of them is us as people are going to welcome, and how we need to learn to respect and understand and help. But it's the other side of the coin. If someone actually wants to come and says they want to do mission and become engaged, we actually should, not wrong, to expect them to learn about that culture, to engage in simple things. Well, in this country, if you want to work with children, you need to have a CRB. Whatever you actually think about it, however it's done back where you come from, that's how it's done. That is the law. If you want to be effective, if you don't want all your parents to study look suspicious at the youth work in your church, it's something... And if we're not careful, there is I think perhaps it's bitter still sometimes paternalism. If we're not careful, we're in danger of believing that people who aren't, that they're not able to study and learn the same missiological principles. There's a lot of missiological thinking about how you engage across cultures. People from other parts of the world, they can learn, they can apply these principles. It doesn't have to be that, whatever they do, that, it's the child, a bit like a child, there's a scribble, and you say, that's a nice picture, because you can't really do better. I think we can accept, these people, they're built churches, they're planted churches, they've got the ability, if they have the will.
Steve, you wanted to come in again on this one?
It's the issue of secular culture.
Yeah, okay.
And just a question. We took a team of students this summer to Brazil to Rio for 2 weeks for a module. Yeah. And we visited a Catholic centre there. And there was a little bit of discussion about mission in secular Europe.
Yeah.
One friar talked about how he visited Spain and was shocked to discuss things with young adults in Spain and how secularized they were. And there's a student here who is from Sao Paulo, and he said that whenever he goes back, he's shocked at how increasingly resistant, the younger adults are to evangelism. So what the kind of evangelism they would have done 10 years ago is no longer working with young adults who are educated, urbanized, blah, 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 affluent. And I just wonder, obviously that poses a question for the Baptist missionaries in England.
Yeah.
It is a reverse mission.
Yeah.
The question I've got is although BMS is now no longer sending missionaries to Brazil, is there a role for reverse mission?
Yes.
To help not only Brazil, but other countries which have been used to a kind of religious supernatural worldview, becoming more secularized, whatever you want to call that, not knowing how to adapt to that.
Yeah.
And although we haven't done a very good job of it, in my opinion, actually sharing some of the non-lessons that we haven't learned. Yeah, well, I think on start point, even if you just share what hasn't worked, that's already a step forward. I've always envisaged, when you have your pipe dream, some kind of way of, and because it could work both ways. It can train people who are coming to this country to deal with the kind of, even just some of the things that I mentioned here, just this basic thing, to deal with some of these issues so you become more effective here. And then again, you sort of are better able when you encounter that. I think, in Brazil, I think what you have in Brazil, at the same time that you have a great Pentecostal boom,
what you have is, to abuse the word, a very also post-Pentecostal movement, people who are put off by the excesses of especially prosperity theology, people who are put off by the excessive fundraising things which are the butt of comedian jokes and they're on the television, and who are put off by some of the more extreme forms of spiritual warfare. They move in, some of them go back to being quite, I know people who've gone from Pentecostal churches to Lutheran, and quite strong Calvinistic. Some of them they define themselves as evangelicals without churches, and some. In Brazil, in a 1990 census, 2% defined themselves as without religion. In 2000, it was 7%. And we got a spate of articles about how the growth of without religion. 2010, it remained stable at about 8%. Now, my joke I sometimes tell is that even the people who are without religion in Brazil are more religious than many of our church members. I mean, they attend church, many of them change church once a month and pray regularly. And I thought, I could think people in my church, I'd be glad if they were without religion. So yes, it's uncertain how strong I could have that small university group who are very influenced by French academia. But I do envisage this sort of, a centre somewhere, or online, something online, which someone who wants, ideally, if you had a real partnership, almost before they were coming to this country, start learning, people here, and you have things, basic concepts. What do you do when people aren't invited to church? What have we learned about relationship, friendship building? What hasn't worked? Why does having, again, a March of Jesus in London perhaps not the best strategy?
I think Andy's next.
Thank you, that's really interesting. I was still reflecting on my home church, which I'm sort of 18 months removed from.
Yeah.
And just questions of what is reverse mission and what is the value of reverse mission. The minister who's been there 8 years now was a BMS missionary in Ecuador. When he arrived at church, there would be one lady who was from Chile, a daughter who married someone from Ecuador, who now lives in Ecuador with him. Now in place is a monthly Spanish service, completely in Spanish, which attracts a group of 40 to 60 people from across the south coast to a church in Sussex, in a village which is 99.999% white British. So the whole congregation don't go to the Spanish service because it's all in Spanish. I've been in Tunnel in PA and failed visibly because I don't speak Spanish and just lost my way completely. We now have a group of 20 people who are going to Cuba on mission next summer. Question as a result of that. And it's there. Is that reverse mission? So a community from Latin America across the south coast reaching out to their family and people in their communities. So Filipino nurses working in the local hospital who are encouraged by attending the monthly service where they have a meal and speak Spanish worship as they would normally do.
Yeah. I'm just smiling to myself because is it the Kevin Bacon theory that everyone's connected by 6? Well, your minister of your home church would have worked with my parents in Ecuador. So everyone's connected. So you always have to behave yourself. I think that's where all terms that we use, they have their use, but they tend to break down at the edges when you push them to extreme. And reverse mission is in that sense like every other term. Now, I gave examples, do they cover? And what we have to be careful is that terms, it remains useful, but it doesn't become a straitjacket. One concern, to put it briefly, use old-fashioned, every soul is equal before God, or every person is equal before God. In a sense, do you have to legitimise caring for a Chilean or an Ecuadorian by hitching on to some other, in a sense, that which is being, done has its own mission value, even if that's all it is. Just as your Ketchin church, which cares for the 80 to 100 Ketchins which live in London, it's doing its mission. And I think we just have to be careful. And I think the term reverse mission starts to break down if you push it to extremes. I mean, the funny one is, okay, you have a Nigerian church, only Nigerians. That's not reverse mission. 10 years later, they've all become British citizens. Is it now reverse mission? in the sense, they're not less British. No, they're other people. You've reached the whole church of British people. And so I think we just have to be careful that the terminology we use, it remains useful rather than a straitjacket, which perhaps also you just recognize God is doing things which are good and important, even if they're not going to have sort of massive knock-on effects, even if all that happens from that thing is that those 20 to 40 Spanish speakers are cared for spiritually, emotionally and socially. Well, that's got its value.
Thank you.
Thank you. Where do you see reverse mission going? Is it rising, declining, or stabilized? I know that we are still struggling with the definition.
Yes.
Yes. Where is it going?
If you're going by this general definition, good question.
Now, where are we?
I say yes, it's general definition. The first thing I would say, I'd be very cautious about making, because I would not claim to have the same knowledge about what's happening in African contexts. And the dynamic of African context is slightly different, because you're talking often with a group of people who are wanting to settle and who have perhaps more of a long-term project than is typically the case of Brazilian churches. So I tend to just be cautious. The ideal thing, in a good one, I think there are examples in just the conversations that we happen, is actually if the reverse mission, and in fact joining in with sort of Stephen's reverse mission, if the reverse mission concept could allow us to progress and all this into perhaps a mission from everywhere to everywhere paradigm, so your Brazilians reaching Pakistanis in that's all part of that would be the ideal, because our society is changing, the churches are changing. Traditional concepts of what it is to be British, what it is to be not. As much as the media would have their pictures of crusades and the flag of St. George and all the rest, it is changing. And you can have two British people whose one's first language is Urdu and the other's first language is Portuguese, but they're British. And I think, in that sense, so perhaps if reverse mission could help us move to actually thinking in terms of mission from everywhere to everywhere, where we are not being paternalistic. Sometimes in a sense of, they can't do any better because they're from another country and they're not as... No, actually, they can learn culture. That's perhaps... There are signs that is happening. That's right. Yeah.
Just following Stephen, what he said, I think I'm the product of reverse mission. My family, we were evangelized when I was 1 year, from the age of 1 year old until the 10th, my 10th year. We were evangelized by British Baptist missionaries. So then, after that, I felt God calling me to come in this country. And as a person that comes here with a strong sense that I'm here to make a difference in the life of British people, not saying only English, I'm saying like people like Daniel was talking about, people that they are Pakistani, but they're from other countries, but they are British because of the citizenship. And I think that one of the struggles, because I think this is what more or less you were talking about, is that sometimes it's difficult for us to understand our role and how to be proficient or efficient in what we do. And this is my struggle here, because sometimes in my church is a multicultural church. Although we have many English, British citizens there, it's difficult for me to understand the many different cultural problems, or perhaps the differences that we have in our own culture. So, but for me, it's easier in a sense. It's difficult, but it's easier because I'm not from this country as well. So then I get to grasp more of it. But the thing I would say is that we need support.
Came to mind one interesting thing. Sometimes I've had sort of Brazilians who and they've gone back to Brazil and shared sometimes their difficulties as Christians from Brazil settling back into the church context in Brazil. That touches. Going back to just another idea that came into mind, so what would be useful is also if a lot of a dialogue over reverse mission could actually be linked with a lot of the dialogue that we have about missional church or fresh expressions of church. If you could get some of these new people coming in, planting churches, in touch with those doing pioneer work within the UK, again, you could see quite a lot of good stuff, I think, emerge from that.
One quick one. Yes.
What would the Brazilian view on a Christendom model look like? So as they come into this country with amazing intentions and amazing integrity, are they coming to recreate a Christendom model, or are they coming to fit in a post-Christendom model?
Okay, that's a good question. I think you can look back in Brazil and you can talk about Brazil as a Catholic Christendom or a Catholic sacred canopy, to use the term, that is collapsing. Now, in a sense, in the West, when the sacred sort of canopy collapsed, the Protestant evangelicals were part of that canopy and facing that collapse. In Brazil, when the sort of Catholic canopy collapses, the evangelicals are kind of ridden the positive wave. Big debate in Brazil is, do we want to create an evangelical Christendom? You read lots of books about the role of evangelicals in politics. And it tends to go, there is a movement in Brazil which would almost say, Brazil belongs to the Lord Jesus, let's claim it for him, let's produce a country run by evangelicals where evangelicals are the majority. Not likely to ever be put into practice, but there is that discourse among Brazilians. That don't tend to encounter it so much in this country with those who come, simply because they can't vote, they have no political rights. The most that their ministers may aspire to is to be invited by a meeting of the Brazilian Foreign Relations Ministry, whereas in Brazil they are invited to the president's cabinet and the governor's cabinet. So that's a very interesting debate in Brazil in terms, do we want to create an evangelical country? I've not sort of detected that among people, and I suspect that, you're never going to have a situation where you'd have that many Brazilians to actually make it irrelevant.
So they're coming more with a view of Pentecostal view, that spiritually dry country.
Yes, and a
country that's lost its Christian heritage.
And the missional struggle that they face, I know this sounds facetious, is they can't find the demons. It's been told to me in interviews, it's difficult here in this country because we don't know where the demons are. Because in Brazil, the demons are in the idols, as they would term it, in the Catholic Church, and in the various spirits of the Afro-Brazilian religions. And so your Protestant evangelical mission is very anti-idolatry and very anti-demonic. Where do you find demons to cast out in the UK? That's what they say. They say sometimes they say we feel the demons. But we just can't find it. And that's one of the reasons why this strategy, which is overtly anti-Catholic and overtly anti-Afro-Brazilian religions, attracts people who have become disenfranchised by that. There's not a large number of ex-Catholics or ex-Umbanda or Candomblé practitioners in Brazil for that to be relevant. In Britain, sorry, for that to be... So does that clarify what...
Well, what an intriguing note to end on. Where are the demons in Britain? Daniel, thank you very much.
Thank you.